There once was a dream by a man who would come to be known as El Libertador, a man who would play a part in freeing many from shackles of different forms. This man, Simon Bolivar. His dream, a united and unified Latin America, capable of not only standing up to its Spanish overlords, but to stand as a power all its own. This unified Latin American nation would come to be known as Gran Colombia. During his time at its head, it would bring the nations of Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador under one banner. It seemed for a moment his dream would come to fruition. And yet, today, there is no Gran Colombia. Latin America is divided, impoverished, and strife-ridden. So today we ask, what if Simon Bolivar's dream had come true? What if Latin America had unified? So why did Simon Bolivar's dream for a unified Latin America die out before it could get going? After leading a series of especially bloody revolts, Simon Bolivar found himself president of Gran Colombia in 1819, which encompassed all of modern-day Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. However, he was not finished. He would lead his army in support of revolutions against Spain in Peru and Bolivia, eventually being declared president of both. He would spend much of his life gallivanting across Peru and Bolivia, attempting to forge them into nations compatible with his pan-Latin American dream. This not only bankrupted Gran Colombia, who financed his expeditions, but also bred resentment against the Peruvians and Bolivians. Pair this with his support for a president for life, and his popularity was in tatters. He attempted to call a grand conference of South American nations to brew sentiments of pan-Latin Americanism. However, it was too little, too late. Opinion of Bolivar, and by extension his idea of a unified Latin America, were at an all-time low. The conference was a failure. Bolivar died in 1830, and along with him any chance for a unified Latin America. So let's change history. Let's make Bolivar's dream come true. Gran Colombia's largest issue was its lack of money. Bolivar blew it all with his essential occupation of Peru and Bolivia, not to mention how much the Peruvians and Bolivians hated him by the end of his life due to this. In an alternative timeline, Bolivar leaves Peru and Bolivia once they were liberated, putting local allies in temporary control to establish democratic republics in the nations. Simon Bolivar is continued to be seen as the liberator by the people of these nations. In Gran Colombia, Bolivar is able to retake control over the nation as president, instead of leaving power to his vice president while he was in Peru and Bolivia. Simultaneously, Bolivar is able to shrink the military budget and give Gran Colombia the money it needs to function as a state. In this alternative timeline, Bolivar's grand constitution he wrote to be adopted in the nations he liberated does not call for a president for life. This allows him to maintain his credibility and legitimacy. It is adopted in Peru, Bolivia, and Gran Colombia itself. It also, just as in our timeline, outlaws slavery and establishes freedom of speech and other liberties. In this timeline, goodwill is much higher at the South American Conference of 1823. Also, the Bolivian delegates make it to the conference on time, which they did not do in ours. By the end, it is decided to found the Gran Colombian Union of Latin American States. Peru and Bolivia joined the union as federal states, while Argentina, Paraguay, and Chile join as more autonomous members. Brazil, being a Portuguese-speaking monarchy which was dominated by a slave-owning upper class, would have no interest in joining such a union. However, as to not assert itself as a rival to this South American power, which may be able to invade Brazil, it establishes various treaties establishing a military alliance and trade agreements. After finishing out his current term in office, Simon Bolivar steps down, just as George Washington did in the United States, allowing for a Bolivarist to be elected as the next president of the Union. So how would this Latin American Union fare in the 1800s? Well, first let's talk expansion. How far could the Union come to encompass? The Central American Federation began to dissolve in 1838 into the Central American states we know today. I see it very likely that in this timeline, Central America would join the Latin American Union to prevent its fracturing. This brings us to the next candidates for joining the Union, Mexico and Brazil. While I don't see it as necessarily likely that both or either of these nations would join the Union, they both have a time in which I would see such an idea as most likely. For Mexico, it is the 1860s. Following the Civil War of 1857, Mexico was under the leadership of liberals. With the United States distracted with its own civil war in 1861, Mexico was vulnerable to Europeans, to whom Mexico owed vast sums of debt. In our timeline, the French would invade Mexico and attempt to place Ferdinand Maximilian Joseph Habsburg in charge. I could see Mexico joining the Latin American Union to protect itself from the European threat. As for Brazil, I see a potential time for accession into the Union to be the 1890s. At this point, Brazil had ousted its emperor and was a republic. Not only this, slavery was finally abolished. I could see Brazil joining the Union as a special autonomous region, maintaining its Portuguese language and more distinct identity. Backtracking now, what would the unification of Latin America do for its development? Without the military juntas of the 19th century and with the abolition of slavery, South America's economy would be able to develop. While agricultural would most likely remain the nation's largest sector, industrialization could set in as well to a much greater extent than it did in our timeline's Latin America. The Union would quickly become a developed economy on the same par as the US and Europe. Railways and other infrastructure are constructed all throughout the Union, connecting its population, allowing for the government to centralize and ushering in a united Latin American identity. I could see Latin America going to war with Spain before the United States did in our timeline, intervening in the Cuban revolts and liberating the Caribbean. Speaking of the US, Latin American-US relations would truly rest on the power of the warhawk faction in the US. If cooler heads consistently prevailed, the two powers could be major trading partners and allies. If not, rivals. Gran Colombia would be a massive nation, with or without Mexico and Brazil. However, for the sake of the map, I will be including them in the Union from now on. If managed correctly, Latin America could see massive levels of immigration and population growth. By the turn of the century, the Union would find itself an equal power to the United States in economic prowess. The Union would play an active role in both world wars, most likely contributing most to the naval war in the Atlantic, siding with the Entente and Allies, with the off chance that if relations had gone perfectly wrong, the Union would join the Central Powers in World War I instead, finding itself at war with the United States. However, I see this as the more unlikely outcome, still worth mentioning. Continuing on the route of Latin entry on the side of the Entente and Allies, we come to the Cold War. Latin America would find itself in a place where it wouldn't need to subject itself to the will of America, being a rich nation far from the UN brought on by the world wars. It is entirely likely that the Union would be a steadfast capitalist nation by its own volition, but it's also possible the Union would have a thriving left wing, with democratic socialist ideas taking root. By the modern day, the world would be truly multipolar, with the Latin American Union profiting greatly from Venezuelan oil fields and southern cobalt supply. Its economy may be the second, if not the largest economy in the world, standing as a superpower of its own right, exerting its influence into the rest of the world, especially in Africa and Asia. This was an optimistic scenario. Truly, a Latin American Union of this scale would be unprecedented. The nations of Latin America didn't share a national identity during the times of Simon Bolivar, and had entrenched elite classes from the times of Spanish rule. If the Union was mismanaged or fell upon misfortune, it is entirely likely it would tear itself apart. But today I decided to look at the best case scenario, to a world that could have been. A better world, where Latin America stood united and was all the more rich and powerful for it.